Hello, everyone. Phil Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. If you'd like to subscribe, click on the subscribe button down here in the lower right, and also the notification bell in the far upper right to be notified when future episodes are released. Today is June 19th, 2022, and our topic today is a new American tragedy. In Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy novel, a girl, Sondra, from a prosperous upstate New York family, fell in love with a distant relative, Clyde, from a pedestrian branch of a second prominent family. This is set in about the 1920s. As their romance blooms, Clyde learns that he has impregnated an earlier humdrum girlfriend, Roberta. Clyde decides that his only solution is to murder Roberta by faking a canoe accident to drown her at one of the area's lakes. Dreiser's narrative, however, reveals that Clyde loses his nerve and abandons the plan. Sensing his unknown anguish as they're sitting in the canoe, Roberta seeks to comfort Clyde by abruptly trying to walk from her end of the canoe to his, and this causes the vessel to overturn. Both are in the water as darkness falls. Roberta drowns, but Clyde manages to swim to shore. Clyde is tried for murder. He is convicted because the jury does not believe he abandons his intent to kill Roberta after they arrived at the scene of the drowning. Part of the reason he was not believed is because his testimony was sometimes confusing. After conviction, he meets regularly with a Reverend McMillan, who helps the prisoner reconcile himself to his fate, which is the electric chair. Clyde had previously testified that he tried to save Roberta when they were both in the water. That was his testimony before the court. Ultimately, the Reverend asks, quote, "Which girl were you thinking of at that time?" Clyde answered honestly, "Sondra, not Roberta." "My son," replied the Reverend, "murder was in your heart at that time." The chain of disasters that overwhelmed Clyde's life could have been traced to that single moment. Similarly, the chain of disasters that has befallen America since the November 2020 presidential election can be traced to Joe Biden's failure to admit that his, quote, "some very fine people on both sides," close quote, claim was also a hoax. Specifically, he began his 2020 presidential election campaign by falsely smearing Donald Trump as praising white nationalists at a 2017 rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, as, quote, "very fine people." He did that in May of 2020, right, a little over 3 years ago. In truth, Trump's remarks referred to protesters of white nationalists and a third group of citizens who were merely protesting the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue and the change of the name for the park away from Robert E. Lee to something else. Now, I'm going to provide you a link for those of you on YouTube, a contemporary CNBC video that proves that Biden's claim was a lie, and that Trump was indeed characterizing the people that opposed the white nationalists and the third group that protested the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue, praising some of them as very fine people, but explicitly excluding the white nationalists. Nonetheless, when Biden and most of the mainstream media were presented with the irrefutable proof that Biden was falsely smearing Trump's reputation by misquoting him. They failed to admit the truth. To this day, they have no shame. Like Dreiser's Clyde Griffiths, they focused only on their heart's desire, which in their case was not a girl named Sondra, but was a successful ouster or a successful removal of Trump from the White House. That was their heart's desire. And that desire was more important than the truth. That is when they murdered the truth. Lying and propaganda has grown ever since. Examples include the, quote, brilliant evacuation from Afghanistan, the, quote, transitory inflation, the condemnation of Republicans for systemic racism, a supposed anti-inflationary impact of the so-called American Rescue Plan, which is a huge deficit spending program, and claims that biracial television commercials are a harbinger of America's salvation. And the inflation is good for the economy because it is an economy in transition to so-called clean energy. That climate change is in itself an existential threat immediately, that there's no time to react. The January 6th demonstrators were not January 6th demonstrators were not a reaction to the unpunished BLM and Antifa riots of the summer of 2020 that resulted in more deaths and far more property damage than the so-called insurrection of January 6th, 2021. And finally, that the sales proceeds of Hunter Biden's paintings are not a form of influence peddling, that the prices that he's getting reflect the intrinsic value of his painting. These are all lies, repeated one after another. Now, America could have avoided our potentially emerging economic tragedy because we don't know where this is all going. But it could have been avoided if we had rejected Biden when he first perpetrated his obvious very fine people hoax over 3 years ago. Okay, that's my message. For those of you that want to get a good story on when the Confederacy came closest to winning the Civil War and winning its independence, I recommend The Confederacy at Flood Tide, $28 at Amazon, $32 if you want an autographed copy from me. And to get that autographed copy, email me, Phil, P-H-I-L _Lee, L-E-I-G-H @me.com. Okay, that's our show for today, and thank you for watching.